No, I just don't want to. Oh, it's just weird. You know where a lot of people live?
They wanted to fragment us with blackouts, thinking we would be lost in their storm. Have they forgotten that bodies of water can flood the streets, striking past their barricades with the waves of Jubilee? Little did they know, a new rain has come. Their solidarity in raindrops. A reminder that the mothers of the martyrs and the mamas of the messengers are channeled into the city. Guided by faith and a deep sense of trust in each other, the people of Sudan bind together through their common pastime, defiance. There is a lot at stake here. We must get out in our masses, for everything depends on it. Surely they know there is not enough bullets to penetrate our solidarity. You can even read the streets like Braille, that these streets will not betray you, even with a lack of vision. We documented everything. Here is the bullet, and here is the proof. Just to show our revolution is bulletproof. We used to peek, just to watch our backs. Now we are back on the streets, so let us watch them peek. The calls for civilian government are set in stone. Even the wheels of revolution were seen on the roads, a movement not only powered by legs alone. We're literally moving through the roads like an ancestral pilgrimage, with deeper roots than the National Congress Party. The police on standby, and remain standing by this day. For what can they do? Our internet connection has been severed, but we find ourselves even more connected. They cut the telephone lines, but couldn't cut the lines in our formation. As we march, each step solidifying our status as a nation. This is a family-building exercise, quite literally. In Sudan, everyone is the engineer of their neighbor's safety, where the small family connects with a bigger family under one flag. Construction projects were used to snipe civilians. Now, construction is underway by the civilians, occupying the same shooting spaces, but with rocks of defiance. We feel ourselves burning through the night. Our heartbeats synchronize with the metal beating. This is the sound of the resistance. They look down on us like ants. They thought they can crush us under their regime. With no value of life towards any of us, men in the army only know how to kill. The people of Sudan only know how to resist peacefully. We carried the heavy burden of this movement for so long. We maneuver with grace as they with fear. They mimicked good faith only to stab us in the back. They stole the revolution, then claim they're setting it back on track. You think cutting our supply lines was enough to buy our loyalty? Does the half price of bread double your ego? How can you starve a nation but feed it with lies? Blackened streets, yet not as blackened as their hearts. Tyrant after tyrant, we took them all down. Burning our rage into the successes of this regime. On the 30th of October, we left an indelible mark on this land. for future generations to come, knowing it is a hazardous journey, but a necessary one. A bullet can penetrate your head, but a bullet cannot penetrate an idea. We are centered around our demands. Our history won't be censored. Our voices are unmuffled. This is not our first stand, nor will it be our last. This is the will of a nation who refused to settle for less.
Between December 2018 and April 2019, Sudanese people went to streets, peacefully protesting and demanding change. And they brought down the 30-year rule of President Bashir. But they remained in the streets and organized sit-ins in the capital, Khartoum, and at least 14 other cities around the country, demanding the military to hand over power to the civilians. In 2 months, on June 3rd, 2019, the leadership of the military groups decided to disperse the sit-ins violently, killing hundreds and injuring thousands in the span of few days. And the internet was completely shut down. Social media, the main platform for news and coordination, was no longer accessible. But the people decided to keep the fight. June 3rd was written in almost every wall in Khartoum and the major cities. Protesters were calling for a 1 million person march. I still remember I was at an intersection driving a car when someone threw a piece of paper inside the car. In that paper, it was written million minus 1 equals 0. Without internet, with little capacity to communicate, June 30 witnessed one of the largest marches in the history of the country. June 30, which was the date Bashir took over power in 1989, got a new meaning. 1.5 months later, the military accepted the same deal that it initially refused. A civilian government was formed to lead a 3-year transitional period with the Sovereign Council representing the military and the civilians. The new government was tasked with addressing a severe economic crisis resulted from a decade-long policies. It was tasked with addressing the huge external debt that prohibited access to external finance. It was tasked with reintegrating Sudan in the international community, with removing Sudan from the US state sponsors of terrorism list and from more than 2 decades-long economic sanctions. It was tasked with reaching a peace agreement with the rebel movements in Darfur, Southern Kordofan, and Blue Nile. It had to work with a systematically weakened civil service. It was tasked with bringing justice to the victims from the protests, to the victims of the human rights violations of the previous regime, and to the victims of the multiple civil wars when the justice system was falling short of the mission. The political parties emerging after a 30-year rule of authoritarian regime to lead the transition couldn't offer a unifying political vision, and very soon fell into political fights that exacerbated polarization in the country. For the military, the moment seemed ripe to take over, and the coup happened on October 25th this year. The internet was shut down again, and still is. Even phone calls and text messages were blocked during the first few days. But despite that, people went to streets on the same day, October 25th. And again, without internet, they organized another historic march just 5 days later on October 30th, the one you just watched the video of. And again, last Saturday, November 13th, another historic march. And again, tomorrow, demanding handing over power to civilians. Reports from Sudan says that since October 25th, 23rd people were killed. Last Saturday alone, more than 200 were injured, half of them with live bullets. And protests are still going and extremely peaceful, despite the state violence. In today's event, our purpose is to bring this conversation to Harvard and to shed light on what's happening in Sudan, what are the implications for the region, how the world is responding, and what is the way forward. My name is Awab Ahmed al-Misbah, a graduate of the Public Policy Program at HKS. Welcome. With me today, Professor Zoe Marks, our Zoe Marks, the lecturer in public policy at Kennedy School, and African global politics. With me also Ilham Ali,
Hey.
and is currently working with a network of international, with Sudanese students globally to bring more attention to and awareness of what is happening in Sudan. She's a MIT student, cross-registered at HKS in the Policy and Technology program. Joining us via Zoom, Nafisa Tahir. Nafisa, a Harvard alum herself, Reuters correspondent for Sudan and Egypt. And Ismail Kushkush, an independent journalist who has been reporting on Sudan for more than a decade to international media. Welcome. Welcome everyone in the room. Welcome to our speakers and those who are joining this event online. I know there are more than 600 people watching this right now. And let us begin. So let's start with Ilham. Ilham, what is happening today in Sudan? Who's organizing these protests? What is it that they do?
Thank you, Awab. I just wanted to start off before we begin this discussion. You mentioned earlier that since the events on October 25th, there are 23 people who have died as part of the protest, and there are hundreds who are injured. So I wanted to just start off by reading their names, providing the name to some of the numbers that we hear in the news. قاسم الصادق, جمال عبد الناصر الشاذلي, محمد عبد الرحيم, القاسم إبراهيم القاسم, محمد صالح, مصطفى محمد محي الدين, محمد عبد السلام ميدو, ياسين عمر ياسين, مروان جمال, أمين خليفة هارون, عبد الوهاب عوض الله, فخر الدين صالح, محمد نور أحمد, عبد الحميد عبد الكريم, الشيخ ياسر علي يوسف, محمد عبد الكريم, حذيفة مزمل محمد نور, أحمد بدر الدين, مجاهد محمد فرح, who was 15 years old, Dimaz Hatem Al-Ata, who was 13 years old and shot at the entrance to her home, Umar Abdullah Adam, Muhammad Usman Al-Tayyib, and Muhammad Abu Bakr. These are the 23 names and the people who have died since the beginning of the protest, and these are the ones that have been able to be confirmed, their identities confirmed by the Central Sudan Doctors Committee. There are a number of violations still being carried out across Sudan that aren't able to be tracked and aren't able to be cataloged because of the internet blackout. This is day number 23 that the internet has been shut off, so almost 3 weeks, despite court orders in Sudan that have ordered a reversal of this decision. The military has offered not to comply. And all of this is in a targeted campaign in order to silence the Sudanese people and to silence their resistance, an example of which you just saw in the video, which we will also see tomorrow on November 17th, when people come out for another Millions March. November 17th is the day that the civilian government was supposed to take a majority in the Sovereign Council. And one of the pressures and the reasons why the military decided to go ahead with their coup on October 25th. So on the streets now, there are groups of neighborhood committees, which are known locally in Sudan as the resistance committees. And they are the leaders, the grassroots leaders of the campaign for pro-democracy and to overthrow the current military coup. They operate, just like their name suggests, on the neighborhood scale. They're organized by and from youth in the community. They have their own elections, and they put out schedules for resistance, for peaceful resistance in a lot of different means, one of which is the Millions March. Other means of resisting include calls for general strikes, calls for professional strikes by teachers' unions, doctors' unions, engineers across the countries, barricading streets so that military regime and personnel cannot enter neighborhoods with such ease, and use different means of force, including live bullets, tear gas, and assault. So these neighborhood campaigns at the moment are spearheading the resistance in Sudan. And they coordinate across the greater Khartoum city region, and they coordinate across all of the cities in Sudan, which is a very important element of the movement, is that it's not just focused in Khartoum, it's not just focused in the center of Sudan, that from the beginning of the protest movements in December of 2018, the protests have been across urban and rural divides in Sudan. And this is one of the things that gives it strength and makes it a true popular movement across the country. And so I wanted to also read, to finish my answer to your question, Nawab, the demands that the protesters have. They have put out 7 demands since the October 30th march. Number 1 is the overthrow of the military coup and handing power back to civilians. Number 2, sending members of the military council to trial immediately for carrying out the coup. Number 3 is no dialogue and no negotiation with members of the military council or its security committees, and rejections of interference from foreign actors. Number 4 is dissolving all militia units in Sudan and creating a unified army that protects the interests of the people and the people's right to freedom, peace, and justice. Number 5 is removing all armed forces from the political process and outlawing and criminalizing the practice of politics by military members. Number 6 is forming structures for transitional authority under the supervision of relevant professional and academic bodies. And number 7 is the complete independence and sovereignty of the Sudanese state to carry out matters of economics, politics, and national security. So these are the outline demands of the resistance committees that they haven't wavered from since the beginning of the protests. And one of the reasons that I wanted to read them here in their entirety is because, like we mentioned, internet services are cut off in Sudan, and it is very difficult for their voice to be heard by international actors, and for international actors to understand also that, you know, these neighborhood committees are not disorganized. In fact, they're highly organized, and they have concrete demands in terms of what they're calling for during this transitional period. And I just wanted also to reiterate that a call for a civilian government is not necessarily a return to the transitional government that was in place before in Sudan, that the military members were a part of. People are calling for a full and total 100% military government, and that's, you know, an important development as well.
Thank you, Ilham. Ismail, do you hear me? So you have been covering the events in Sudan for quite a long time. How do you assess the scale of the change that the country is going through since December 2018?
The revolution of 2018, 2019, I think we have to recognize some serious political, social, and economic changes that have happened during the transitional period. Politically, of course, the obvious is the change of the government and the fall of the government of Bashir, and then the establishment of this very transitional government. I think it's key to remember that this is supposed to be a transitional period into a democratic period that, you know, with the signing in August of 2019 of the declaration document that would lead to elections in 2023. That was the initial. So there was that political change. and also at the foreign relations level, we saw the reapproachment that Sudan has made with different actors, the removal of Sudan from the U.S. state-sponsored terrorism list, the lifting of U.S. sanctions. That's at the political level. At the legal and social level, we saw initiatives to reform the Sudanese legal system, the removal of the of legal statutes that had the Public Order Act, which was a law that was seen by many women's groups as restricting the rights of women. That was removed. The Apostasy Act, where acts back then that were considered to be blasphemous, was removed from the legal system. So we saw a number of legal changes throughout this transitional period, whether it be in the legal side, the social side, politically, the introduction of economic reforms, working with the World Bank, et cetera, with the IMF. I think these are some of the gains that you can see, and with the various reservations that some here or there might have of some of these initiatives, there certainly, I think Sudan was moving towards a new era, whether it be politically, socially, or economically.
Thank you, Ismail. Nafisa, it has been said that the December Revolution did not really attract global attention until very late, especially after the June 3rd massacre in 2019. How are the events in Sudan today being represented in regional and global media outlets?
Hi, okay, before I answer, I just want to speak for the people on Zoom. I think if we turn off the organizer sound, not your sound, but the other one, people might hear a little bit better because there's been some complaints in the chat. But anyways, so to answer your question, I think one important thing is that Sudan has gone from being a somewhat unknown or not understood country to being one that has a little bit more name recognition, and name recognition for the democratic or the pro-democracy movement. You know, Sudan used to be kind of a country that was, if there's name recognition, it was about conflict, it was about poverty, these kinds of like negative connotations, and there is a more positive connotation now with the pro-democracy movement, with some of that kind of thing. So it's kind of, the pickup is quicker, if that makes sense. Like you kind of said, it took until the June 3rd massacre last time around to kind of get like a lot of coverage. I always, as a journalist, like I always kind of argue that, like, you know, we were covering it from the beginning, we were covering it from December 18th and before that. It's, the coverage is there, but people aren't necessarily reading. And it takes kind of a big event like June 3rd to kind of get it on people's radar. And I think that because of that, because it was kind of recent, people kind of were able to, once this started happening, kind of pick it up again a little bit quicker. Regionally, you do see that there's kind of, you know, differences in who's covering. Of course, it's harder to cover with the internet blockage. I think a lot of people in Sudan and outside of Sudan are relying specifically on Al Jazeera to cover, and Al Jazeera Mubashir specifically, which kind of on days of protests and even other days kind of does like wall-to-wall Sudan coverage. It's probably the only international media that does wall-to-wall Sudan coverage. Some of the other Gulf channels, which are, and I'm mentioning them because that's one of the main sources for people inside Sudan, as well as in the diaspora. The other channels have been a bit less, or much less, and that kind of reflects different dynamics that we can get into later. But yeah, so I think just to kind of summarize, it's definitely kind of been a faster pickup than it was a couple years ago.
Thank you, Nafisa. Professor. Okay. Professor, over the last 5 to 10 years, many African countries witnessed some forms of protests. Other countries in the global south witnessed similar protests from Latin America to Asia. These social movements coincided with the rise of right-wing authoritarianism in the north. How do you read what's happening in Sudan in the broader context of Africa and globally? What are some of the implications you see?
There are a lot. Let me just start by saying thank you so much for including me in the conversation, and thank you both for organizing it. I think it's really important that we have Sudanese voices leading the conversation, but also that it's happening here at the Kennedy School. So I just wanted to honor that and let you know that my thoughts are with your families and communities in pursuit of safety and liberation. So in the broader context, I mean, there's a lot I could say, so I'll try to draw a couple of threads and then we'll come back to them. But I think one, you mentioned a sort of rising authoritarianism, or sometimes we call it democratic backsliding, depending on how optimistic you are about the march of history. And I would say that it's important to remember that Sudan has a deeply entrenched history of authoritarianism, and specifically military authoritarianism. So this is not like a new coup. In a lot of ways, there's, the analogy that most people are reaching for is Egypt, because of General Burhan, who led the coup and was leading the transitional council, because of his close ties with Sisi and with the Egyptian counter-revolution as a sort of blueprint for how to reclaim the state. And I would also just acknowledge, particularly for those who aren't as familiar with the political economy of Sudan, that a lot of the businesses, corporations, key infrastructure are owned and controlled and generate profit for military generals. And so the state is very, very robust. This is not a case of sort of state fragility, state weakness, some of these buzzwords that we hear Western governments use to describe a sort of vacuum. It's rather that the state is very strong, very centralized, and very militarized. And so I think that that's something where it's like important to kind of specify what Sudan's kind of political nature is before we generalize. A couple of other quick things I wanted to note in putting it in context. There's been a global increase in popular protest movements. So really to center the people of Sudan and the protest that's happening. This is part of a broader wave of protests, but as we've seen protests increase around the world, we've also seen protests become less successful around the world. And so it's not entirely clear for those of us who study social movements really why this failure rate is happening, but there's some reason to believe that governments are getting savvier at how to neutralize and repress protest movements. And I think we're seeing that unfold in Sudan, that it's going to be more difficult this time around to kind of sustain and succeed in the popular movement for civilian government and ultimately democracy, because there's been iterative learning on the part of the military just as much as there's been learning on the part of the neighborhood organizations and civil society. And so in addition to that increased failure rate, there's also been an increase in the use of sort of like right-wing or authoritarian popular protest. And so we also saw this just before the coup happened. There was a pro-military protest that was sort of staged in Khartoum that gives the kind of illusion that there's a popular demand for the military. And so you get these weird sort of both sides dynamics where there's a theater of popular protest that the right wing is, or in this case, the military is pursuing, while the people who are actually calling for civilian rule have to kind of overwhelm that, right, with 1 million people in the streets. The internet outages are also hugely prolific, particularly across Africa, but also around the world. And I think that's particularly worrying for, those of us like our experts on the screen who are interested in the, the sort of the use of information to not only achieve safety and security, but also things like accountability and liberation. And then one last note, in Africa specifically, to put Sudan in context, it's not in a particularly democratic neighborhood geographically. That's really important to know. It's also part of the triad of countries on the Ethiopian Renaissance Dam conflict. So Egypt and Sudan have sort of special interests to maintain their alliances. I think these sort of regional dynamics matter more than some of the global dynamics. But there's a huge generational shift, and there are a lot of reasons to believe that older military authoritarian rulers aren't going to ever be able to kind of placate the popular demand for accountability, transparency, and responsive government. And so that would be my sort of hopeful context, which is that there's a degree of inevitability about the collapse of the military coup, but it's a question of when and how.
Thank you so much. Back to you, Ismail. So given what we heard about the political economy of Sudan and the militarized state, the state of like a military control, what do you think what are the political events and dynamics that actually led to this military coup since April 2019, when, or at least since August 2019, when a civilian government was brought to lead the transition? What led to this moment that we are in right now? What do you think?
I mean, one can speculate. I mean, I think the first thing is the approachment of the second half, supposedly, of the transitional period. According to the agreement that was made between civilian forces and the military, that the first half would be headed by a military representative, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and you have this joint civilian military partnership. The second half, which was supposed to be tomorrow or the day after, was to have a full civilian government. I think the approachment of this period, I think, was of concern to the military. The idea of transferring or handing over full power to the transitional civilian government. That's one. Second, I think the question of accountability. One of the issues that I think has been on the minds of some of those within the military is the question of justice, accountability, and whose names might appear. There are a number of crimes, alleged crimes, war crimes that have taken place in Sudan. Most notably, of course, the June 3rd massacre of 2019 that saw the deaths of over 120 protesters at a sit-in in front of the army headquarters. The names of those that were involved in that massacre may or are suspected to be, a part of the military, and it's key to those who may not be following Sudan closely. But the very military council is really two parts: the army, and you have the rapid support forces. The rapid support forces is this officialized militia that became a part of the official military council. Names that are tied to the massacre of June 3rd, let alone other war crimes in Sudan, such as the war in mountains and other areas of Sudan. I think the investigation into those crimes and whose names I think is something that may have, or clearly was something that those in the military were worried about. There are a number of other issues that we can also discuss. I mean, I don't think that we can look at the civilian side of the transitional government, that it was exempt from mistakes, faults during this transitional period. Some of the rhetoric, I think, from some of those on the civilian side may have made some on the military side concerned of what place that the military may have. We know that the former government, the government of Omar al-Bashir, the role of Islamists in any new what kind of political future would they have? I think those are some of the signals that have made the military take the action that it did. But really, I think the key issue here is accountability of losing power. And then there's something else. I think we know that the military in Sudan, be it the army or the rapid support forces, also had control of or had companies in their names that controlled a big part, really basically, of the Sudanese economy. The calls to have those companies under civilian leadership, under civilian oversight, I think was also a part of the military's action, that they would lose access to wealth, let alone authority, then accountability. I think all of this may have played a big part in the military's decision to act on October 25th.
Thank you, Ismail. Ilham, so these events, these concerns contributed somehow to what we are seeing now. I just want to bring us back to your initial response. How are people now facing this reality? Like, what is it that they're doing? How they're organizing? What tactics? What strategies they're using to resist a military that is learning and iterating, as Zoe said?
I think it's definitely true that the military establishment continues to learn and to use new repressive tactics to try and quell protests. One of which being, like, in addition to shutting off the internet, shutting off Signal and shutting off SMS so that you can't call and you can't text, which is one of the ways that protesters mobilized on June 3rd or June 30th after the June 3rd massacre. And I think it's important to go back to some of what Ismail was saying is there were a lot of dynamics and things happening before the events of the coup on the 25th that are important to take into consideration. I think it's obvious from some of the actions, specific actions taken by the military, what it is that they feared with the coming of the November 17th deadline. Some of the first things that they did were, in addition to getting rid of the Sovereign Council and getting rid of the Cabinet of Ministers, they got rid of the Empowerment Committee, which was tasked with repossessing state resources from the military, which, as we mentioned, are directly oversighted by some of those who sit on the military council presently, including General Burhan, including Hemeti, who's the leader of the RSF forces, Kabashi, some of these people that you've seen since the Transitional Military Council. In addition, they also took away an article that talked a lot about the dissolution of the Transitional Military Council that was in power during the days of the sit-in. So they're effectively trying to revert back to that state of what Sudan was like between April and June of 2019, before they were forced into a civilian partnership with the transitional government that was there. And like you mentioned also, they fear accountability for their crimes. The June 3rd massacres, not only is it well known on the street who perpetrated those massacres, but it is well documented as well. It is well documented, and those who sit on the Transitional Military Council are very likely to be indicted in a lot of those things, as well as their previous crimes in Darfur and other regions of Sudan. And I think the streets know all of these things, and they believe that it's a matter of time before the military council does fall. In addition to some of the, we talked about some of the grievances, legitimate grievances that people had against the civilian side of the government. I think in light of, despite all of those things, that people are united behind one goal, and that is the reinstitution of a democratic government, or at least a transitional authority that can get Sudan to a transitional government, which is the same thing that we took to the streets for in December of 2018 and 2019, that so many people have died in service of. And the sense in Sudan is, we talk about the people who have passed, but martyrs in Sudan are very, very sacred to the community. Their deaths are not taken lightly, and to turn back at a time like this would be a great betrayal of all of the people who have died so far. And that's one of the slogans also that you hear on the street, "Arid mustahila," which means that turning back is impossible. And that's the sense that you get on the street. And so all of the things that the neighborhood committees are doing now are part of a long history and a long, a historic legacy of revolutionaries in Sudan. In 1964, people came out and took down General Aboud. Same thing in 1985 with General Nimeri. So a lot of these, these tactics that we talk about are passed down through generations, and even now passed down through the December Revolution. Many of the neighborhood resistance committees have been the same people who have been on the streets for 3 years. So you can imagine that they also learn and they iterate, and they learn and advance from the tactics of the military and other, state entities. So I guess to circle back to your original question, which is what do people actually do on the streets? You can, for example, follow like the pages of the different resistance committees, and they do put out schedules of resistance. So the one advantage, or the strongest advantage of nonviolent peaceful protests, is that you have quite a lot of things under your purview. They have guns, and they have proven that they're willing to use them against the Sudanese people. But the will of the people is stronger together. Millions of people coming out to the street. You'd be surprised that they're the ones carrying guns, and they're the ones with anti-aircraft artillery, but they're the ones who are afraid of us when we're all out in the street together. People who have nothing in their hands, not even rocks, just people with their 2 fingers up and symbols of peace. So the people together are stronger, and that's the principle that unites all of the resistance activities that are called for by the committees and that are carried out by people in the streets. Like we said, also the military fears economic kind of backlash. And one of the things that the general strike, or what is called civil disobedience in Sudan, it brings the economy to a grinding halt. So people don't go to school, people don't go to work, the streets are closed down. There's no income coming into the government, which actually creates quite a lot of pressure for them. And they've shown, by dissolving the Economic Empowerment Committee, and then also creating a committee to investigate the Economic Empowerment Committee, that they're very afraid of their assets being repossessed. So that's definitely one of the strongest methods of resistance that we have, but it requires also a lot of support, because the economic situation in Sudan today, there's runaway inflation. People are truly suffering, and people live day by day in Sudan. So during these periods of general strike, the neighborhood committees also have a very strong role in terms of supporting families who are in need, getting them the things that they need in order to not go to work, in order to not, be aiding in the economy and helping, effectively helping the military. But really, you have to think about it from a community level, that these things do put a lot of strain on people. So I think the streets are aware of these things. And so they organize, in a resistance level, but they also organize at a support level for their communities.
Thank you, Ilham. And to the learning part, it took the neighborhood committees a month to organize the first march when the internet was shut down the first time, and it took them really 3-4 days this time to do it, and they're doing it literally every week. So yeah.
3-4 hours even after the announcement was made.
That is true. And so to the economic point, and also back to Zoe's point about the region, I want to go back to Nafisa. About the regional dynamics. So we know that the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, among others in the region, are criticized for allying against emerging democracies in the Middle East and North Africa. We know that they forged strong relations with the military and the rapid support forces in Sudan. They're strong allies. However, many of these countries issued joint statements calling for restoring the civilian government under the pressure of the US and the UK. But they're still accused of supporting the coup. So how did regional players react to what is happening in Sudan? How are they involved? What are their positions or interests in what is going on from the coverage that you do to what's happening in the region?
Right. Okay. So I think one thing that's very important to note is that the relationship that specifically General Burhan and General Hemeti have with the UAE and Saudi specifically goes back to the days when they were serving under Bashir, because they were, as part of their roles, their separate roles, quite involved in the Sudanese effort in Yemen. And so they were kind of interacting with a lot of these leaders years ago. It's also important to note that them bringing down Bashir happened in part because we did like a whole story about this, but in part because the UAE kind of felt like he was kind of no longer serving their interests, that he was kind of in his desperation to kind of keep afloat, he was starting to form relations. He visited Syria, he was deepening relationships with Russia, Qatar as well. And so, I think it's important to note that those countries very much supported the bringing down Bashir. They quickly, after the military removed Bashir on April 11, a couple weeks later, they offered $3 billion in aid to Sudan. It's also important to note that as the civilian government or the civilian cabinet rather kind of moved in, that funding did not, I don't think at this point, I don't quote me on this, but I don't think it's been paid in full. And so that's kind of, I think, a really important context, that these kind of relationships go way back and that they were very supportive of the military bringing down Bashir. It's also important to think about what these countries' interests are, which I think was one of your questions. Look, so one of their overarching interests is anti-Islamism, right? So all of these countries are very much anti-Islamist in explicit terms. And Bashir was an Islamist, of course, and so they ostensibly kind of will reject any kind of return to that in Sudan. That makes Burhan's latest moves of kind of bringing in some former Bashir, people who kind of served under Bashir, not like the top names, but people who were known to have been, you know, government bureaucrats under Bashir, bringing them back, that could be problematic for that relationship. And that's why I think you don't see until now, it's been a few weeks now, and we haven't seen a high profile UAE, Saudi, Egyptian visit to Sudan. It's a very different dynamic to what happened in 2019. At the same time, we didn't see at first any rousing condemnations. We saw recently the joint statement with the United States and the UK, but we haven't necessarily, and that was with specifically Saudi Arabia and the UAE, we haven't seen a wider rejection. Another important point to make is that, so again, thinking about their interests, you know, UAE and Saudi specifically, they have a lot of interest in getting agricultural investments in Sudan. The UAE has been pushing this normalization with Israel. And these are all things that Sudan's civilian government has been very amenable to. It hasn't pushed up any barriers towards these kinds of collaborations or these kinds of interests. At the same time, you know, when it comes, for example, to normalization, ultimately, the Hamdok's line has always been, you know, some things will go to parliament, some things will kind of have to be discussed as a country. Similarly with the Red Sea ports issue, which is a huge issue for these countries. That's also something that's kind of being put to popular discussion. And that is a bit worrying to these countries, right? So they're, especially as monarchies, they're not used to having to deal with kind of popular discussion over these kinds of issues. So it's kind of, I feel like I might be a bit messy, but that's because it's kind of a mixed bag. It's very unclear, kind of, there's some elements that would kind of boost, you know, their maybe support for the coup, and there's some elements that would kind of go against that. And I think a large part of ultimately where they fall will have to do with US pressure and Western pressure. Egypt is a slightly different case. I know I've gone a bit long, so I'll kind of keep it short. It's been reported by other outlets that Egyptians kind of gave a explicit go-ahead for the coup. There's also very strong relationships between the Sudanese military and Egyptian military. Burhan is known to have, you know, done some of his military training in Egypt. There's just a very strong military relationship there. And so it's very conceivable that Egyptians are much more comfortable with a military government in Sudan than a civilian government in Sudan. But again, I think even in the Egyptian case, I think a large amount of their ultimate response and ultimate support will have to do with American pressure and Western pressure, but mainly American pressure, because these are all countries, this is the last point I'll make, these are all countries that are trying to various degrees to kind of sweeten their relationship with the Biden administration. The Biden administration is very different from the Trump administration, and is looking at these countries with a much more skeptical eye than Trump was. Trump would probably have loved this whole situation, to be honest, and the Biden administration very much doesn't. And so I think ultimately kind of how isolated this government or this takeover ends up being and how much these countries maybe will start to inch over, it has to do with how sustained the American pressure is going to be on those countries. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Nafisa. So this brings us to the US foreign policy, and to Ismail. We want to understand where does the US stand, and I'm asking because the US president has appointed a special envoy to the Horn of Africa who visited Sudan recently, who met with Sudanese leaders, including the military, just a few days before the coup. The US issued multiple statements calling for restoring the civilian government, but it is also claimed that they might accept the status quo, given Egyptian and Israeli support for the military in Sudan, and also the alleged support of the Gulf countries. So what is the U.S. policy right now? What is its interests and how they're engaging with what is happening in Sudan?
The official U.S. position has been to condemn the coup along with other international actors, the European Union, United Nations, the African Union, of course, suspended Sudan's membership in that body. How the U.S. proceeds beyond the condemnation, I think, will be dictated by how things unfold and the attempts to find some sort of solution between the military and the civilian forces. The official position of the U.S. government, from what we've seen so far, is to support the democratic transition. There has been funding, there's been money put into that process. But how, where does this stand in a few weeks, a few months? I think will depend on how things unfold between the military. I mean, there are a number of issues I think that we need to keep at least in the back of our minds. One is the position and influence of regional actors, such as Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and such as the United Arab Emirates, and Israel. Israel, of course, has become a new player into how politics is seen or perceived on Sudan. The Israeli government is keen on seeing this Abrahamic Accords initiative, this bringing it closer to Arab governments, go through, and we see that the Sudanese transitional government has become a part of that. How it became a part of that is a whole nother discussion, but I think going back to the Trump administration and government of Netanyahu, but I think that the roles of regional governments, I think, will play a part in how the U.S. proceeds. There are a number of other issues also. I mean, I think questions of security as Sudan goes forward. In beyond democratization, will security issues come into play in how what gets prioritized in among U.S. interests in Sudan? Not only in what is happening in Sudan, but also I think it's important to keep and pay attention to what's happening right next door to Sudan in Ethiopia. The instability in Ethiopia and what that means in terms of militant groups, rebel groups, refugees, I think will play a role in shaping U.S. policy towards Sudan eventually, as well as the European Union. Sudan has been the receiving country of many Ethiopian refugees. What that might mean for a new, larger refugee crisis, like the one we saw in 2015, what that might mean for militant groups, let alone in Sudan itself, will resistance to the military remain nonviolent, where will some be pushed into other forms of resistance? I think as things play out, I think U.S. policy will develop as well.
Thank you, Ismail. And before I open it up to the floor to ask any questions, I want to conclude with one question to Professor Zoe. And the mic is here if anyone wants to start. So given what is happening in the region, what just Ismail and Isa talked about, and in the background of the great pole competition, framework of thinking about foreign policy in the US, and like how the what are the U.S. interests in the region? How policymakers in the U.S. how should they think about what is going on in the region and in Sudan in particular?
Thank you for the question, Awab. And I have to say, Ismail and Nafisa, you've kind of gone through each of my bullet points, so I don't have a ton more to add, but I'll elaborate a bit beyond the bounds of what you've already said, all of which I completely agree with, and I thank you for raising those points. I tend to give the US a hard time for being a sort of absentee partner and ally with African nations. I tend to give the US a hard time for being sort of fixated on bilateral relationships when Africa's 55 countries need to be engaged regionally, sub-regionally, and in concert with one another in order to strengthen their Pan-African power. But I will say the US special envoy did really try. And like literally as the plane took off, there was a coup. And so I think that the Biden administration and the State Department, were caught off guard. I think they're offended. I think they've broken a lot of trust. And I think that that's an interesting starting point for Burhan if he thinks that this is a sustainable government, right? And so I think it's interesting to go back to the demands of the protesters and to think about the paradox of not wanting foreign intervention, but knowing that the sort of the quad of UAE, Saudi, UK, and US, getting Saudi and UAE to sign that much stronger statement than the sort of like, he's our guy. That's a big deal. That's a big win, I think, for the US and the UK, and they shouldn't take it for granted. But I think it's a challenge to think about how do you have grassroots democracy and accountability, knowing that those two regional partners had a hand to play in creating two powerful militarized leaders who now also are deep rivals with one another. And so I don't know what the solution is for people on the ground, but I'm sure there's a lot of dialogue happening about when and how can we safely engage outside actors. And I think that the crisis in Tigray in Ethiopia really complicates like the local chessboard, if you will, not just because of the displacement and refugee kind of influx that can inaugurate, but because you don't want to see sort of two civil wars emerging in pursuit of peace and freedom, right? So there's two other quick points that I wanted to make just in terms of how should the US think about it. One is like, don't sleep on Russia, right? The Wagner Group is sort of this amorphous kind of mercenary recruitment mechanism that looks for mining opportunities, maybe ports. Like, there are lots of reports and not a lot of information about what they're doing in Sudan. I gather with Hemeti, but I'm not an expert on either Russia or what the RSF is doing. So that's one thing just to kind of motivate the United States to not give up and not become complacent. And then I think it's like totally wonderful that we've gone through this whole conversation without talking about China, but it's worth mentioning China in terms of China-Africa relations, because whether it's a civilian government emerging from this or whether the military is able to hold on and consolidate power further, I think China is just waiting in the wings and trying to keep its, powder dry, hands clean, pockets ready to move in. And if there was to be a transformation in who holds on to the sort of political economy and those business interests and the mining interests, then I think Chinese capital would potentially be very interested, specifically because of the regional neighborhood that Sudan is in. And so the last point that I'll make is like the US needs a better model than trying to do this sort of piecemeal approach to counter all of these so-called competitors, right? And for me, it's always going to come back to, are you empowering the African Union? Are you coordinating with the EU, which is financing the African Union's peace and security architecture? I was very impressed with the swift response from the EU. It was faster than the World Bank, as far as I can tell from the reporting. But they're currently having meetings about countering violent extremism, because like EU financing moves like the Titanic around an iceberg. And so, violent extremism and radicalism, like that matters. We just saw the news about the attacks in Uganda, but also like the collapse of a government that was on its way to being controlled by the people. I think that's its own peace and security crisis. And so I'd like to see a bit more coordinated action to really strengthen the AU to deal with governance crises that pose security challenges. And that's always been the hardest nut to crack for the African Union.
Thank you so much. And let's spend some time hearing questions from the audience. Who wants to start? Yes, please just introduce yourself and.
Thank you. Thank you. Mandla here from Mid-Career and Mason Fellow. Professor Marks, you got into my question. I wanted to ask about the role of the African Union. I'm South African, and I was part of I was in the South African government when there was a clamor amongst civil society in South Africa to arrest President Bashir a few years ago and not allow him to leave. And for better or for worse, our government decided to let him leave in the middle of the night. So I guess I wanted to ask about the role the African Union is playing, could be playing. Obviously, the African Union always makes the right noises about unconstitutional changes of government. But the question is, I hear you talking about the four main players that seem to be mediating the conflict, but don't seem to really be the African Union. We've seen the same situation in Libya, that the AU kind of issue statements and make noises, but are they really kind of listen to, influential? Are they actually trying to play a helpful role? So I guess I wanted to ask, what do you see as being the most helpful role the African Union and other kind of leading players on the continent can play in addressing this issue? Thank you.
Take that and then hand it to my colleagues who probably have their own strong opinions. I think it's important to know what like the AU won't do, and then to open space for what it can and should do. And one thing is, the meeting that I was talking about on violent extremism is being hosted in Egypt. Right? Egypt is a key player in the African Union and wants to be seen as such. And so I think that it's important to recognize that there's always these sort of compound conflict of interest issues, and that's the deep history of the OAU, as you know all too well, right? But I think what it can do is think much more rigorously about how to put money, resources, and safety and capacity into civil society, right? And that might be a way around that challenge of needing external leverage without wanton foreign co-optation of the movement, is to think about what are the demands to the AU and to regional players as regional blocs, rather than as these sort of, piecemeal interlocutors and mediators, but really thinking about what does civil society, what do neighborhoods, what do communities need in order to strengthen their interconnectedness, in order to strengthen access to information. I mean, I don't know how satellites work, but I don't understand why we can't just jerry-rig the internet and make sure that the AU ensures that there's always access to internet in all countries in Africa.
Ismail or Nafisa, if you have any response, or we can take another question.
I don't have, I think Zoe touched on a lot of important points. I don't have a huge overarching view on the African Union, but I think it's important to note that the African Union played a hugely important role in the original agreement, for better or for worse. They basically brokered the entire thing. Hamadou Labat, who was a Mauritanian, he kind of brokered the thing. They had lots of late night meetings. This time around, the envoy, I'm missing his first name, but it's the former Nigerian president, Obasanjo, if I'm not mistaken. And he had a very minimal, he was like a one-day visit, in and out. And I mean, there could be lots of reasons for that. It could be that it's just a different situation. It could also be, where the Bat was able to kind of speak to everyone in Arabic and kind of maybe have a bit more of an easier kind of relationship with all of them. But the African Union just in general, I was gonna say the IGAD, but Sudan is the president of the IGAD right now, so it can't really help itself. They kind of played much bigger roles, and this time it's not happening.
Thank you. Another question?
Go ahead.
Hello, thank you for hosting this.
After her, then we'll just ask like one question.
Sorry?
After she's answered.
Okay. Take the Zoom first.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Thank you for hosting this. So I don't know if you guys have the answer, but I'd like the larger audience also to participate in forming this question of the infantilization of civilian leadership in Africa. I think that the question of why does Sudan matter, or why is this different, is really important in identifying the historical colonial impact of military dictatorship ruling and governing the Sudanese people. There's a saying, if you're leading and no one's following you, you're taking a walk. And the truth is, no one's following these military dictators. No one believes in them. This is a united movement. But they're being validated regionally, like you've identified, and historically. And this cycle of military hijacking coups and counter-revolutions is a old tale of Africa. So to the larger community, how can we finally stop seeing Black people as less than, and Africans as less than, and autonomous, and worthy of their own sovereignty, and taking space and leadership? That's it. Oh, my name is Safa Babikir. I'm in the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Thank you.
Thank you, Safa. Idham.
I just want to say thank you for your question and forming it the way that you did, and always centering the humanity of the people that we're talking about here today. I think definitely one of the things that keeps recurring in Sudanese history and African history is, like you were saying, co-opting of movements and counter-revolutions, the consolidation of power in the military or other state entities. And I think it's really important also that you bring up the colonial regimes in Sudan and the military regimes that followed it, interspersed with some periods of democracy. But one of the real outcomes of those periods is the centralization of power in Khartoum, specifically in the case of Sudan, and the centralization of power in the state and in the military, even in how the peripheries are run. The reason why there's such a proliferation of militias in Sudan that run a lot of rural areas, why there are monopolies on certain markets. All of those are legacies of the colonial regime and legacies also of subsequent military regimes that use the same methods of power. And one thing that we didn't talk about today in this discussion is also the leaders and the militia factions in Sudan who were signees of the Juba peace agreement in 2020, all but two of the groups, and who ultimately during this coup have almost all of them come out publicly on the side of the military. Right? So the idea is that there is definitely a thread of convenience, a marriage of convenience between whomever and the military, the civilians and the military, the rebels and the military, because they represent the centralization of the state and the power of the state. Many times the civilian sides of the government are perceived as weak because they compromise, because they don't have the consolidation of resources that the military has. This is what happened also in the last brief period of Sudanese democracy in the 80s. That government was perceived as so weak that the salvation government of Bashir also had the opportunity to come in. Very similar to the cycles of history that we see now. I think it's very important, just to recognize that legacy and those power structures are still in place today, and they play a large role in the dynamics of things that play out in these movements. And just going back, to popular resistance in the streets. I really appreciate your point of just our lives mattering for the sake of them mattering. That there was a statement the other day by I believe one of the U.S. representatives that thanked the military and their security forces for the use of restraint because they had only killed 3 people in those protests. The tone of such messages and the signal that you're sending really is that these lives are expendable. And I think on behalf of people in the Sudanese street, people in Sudanese society, it's that's a totally unacceptable stance to have. And I think it's just indicative of how kind of the larger world feels like that we as Sudanese people, we as Africans are accustomed to death. We're accustomed to our lives not being worth anything, and that's not the case. All of these people, all of the names that we read, they're integral parts of their community. They're friends, family, neighbors. A lot of people in the Sudanese community in the diaspora in Sudan, all of these martyrs, all of these injured protesters that we talk about, they're connected to someone. You know, a lot of people have a personal experience in relation to this. There are even some people in this room today who have, you know, experienced the violence of these regimes firsthand. And, you know, I think just to honor the human toll that this takes, the human toll that resistance takes, like what a statement of power it is for you to come out to the streets day and day again, even when you're being repressed, even when you're facing bullets, even when the world isn't listening to you. You know, one of the sad things that, like, you know, when I call some members of Sudanese society who are out on the streets now, they'll come out for a Millions March. And, you know, the last one, Al Jazeera reported that there are 4 million people on the streets all across the cities of Sudan. That you'll call someone and they feel like, well, what's the point? Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed, you know. And now there's another Millions March. We're going to go out again. I'm going to see my friends get shot. You know, I'm going to also come under the same stress, under the same duress. Like, what is happening in the international community? Who is responding to these things? Why doesn't our own military care about us? You know, why does the broader world not care about us? And I just think that it's really important, you know, for people on the outside to take a stand, you know, to send a very strong message that that's not the case, and to stand with, you know, with protesters, because I think they've given us the strongest example of resistance, and really all we can do is mirror it.
Thank you, Ilham. Yeah, let's take one question.
So we'll take one question from Zoom, and then we'll go back into the room. So they're saying here there's currently a concurrent Congress resolution to enforce, and this is from Awab Abdulrahim Halim, Sarah. A concurrent resolution to enforce targeted sanctions on the leaders of the military coup and their accomplices. Is there any evidence in practice or in research literature to support the efficacy of targeted sanctions?
Okay, let's hear from Ismail and from Zoe.
I'm going to defer to Zoe. I think that's more of a public policy. You know, but let me just say one thing though. As far as the efficacy of sanctions, I think one of the problems, one of the challenges I think with sanctions is when those on the receiving end, when in the case of U.S. sanctions and other even UN sanctions previously on Sudan, the government of Bashir was able to manage and maneuver through the sanctions and sustain its government. Those who suffered the most were the average Sudanese in terms of spare parts, you know, for airlines or even medical equipment. And one story that I had worked on was the only breast cancer hospital, not only in Sudan but really in the Horn, that could not get supplies because of the sanctions. So I think in terms of sanctions, that how sanctions are applied, I think is something that should be considered. But I mean, as far as the efficacy of targeted sanctions, I think maybe you'll express that better than me.
Ismail, I was looking forward to your answer, and I would also look forward to the opinion of Awab who asked it. I think, you know, I'm not a specialist on sanctions, but I'll just put it into its sort of immediate perspective, which is that the U.S. government is currently withholding $700 million worth of what would basically be humanitarian aid for the people of Sudan. And so I think at a minimum, if you're going to withhold food and medical support, you should also cut off access to wealth acquisition. And the reason why targeted sanctions are sometimes not at the top of the list is partly because of the theory of change. But like, tell me about the theory of change between democracy and feeding people, right? Like, there are lots of things that we don't have a very solid theory of change on. But it's also because those sanctions have to do with the movement of wealth into like advanced capital markets for the purposes of investment. And so they become totally alienated from the people's lives who should otherwise be entitled to those receipts. And so I mean, I'm just showing my hand, like I'm personally in favor of targeted sanctions when you have people who you think are also in the queue for war crimes trials and for domestic accountability. And so I think it's really important to just make sure that we're always being kind of commensurate in thinking about why are we withholding 700 million, which frankly isn't that much money for the people of Sudan, if we're not pursuing targeted sanctions of an illegitimate leader.
Thank you, Zoe. Let's take just one last question. Yeah.
So we could take two, because someone,
Okay, we'll take another one.
so we can just make it very short.
Hello. My name is Ilaf Abdurrahman. I'm a student at the Divinity School, and I just want to say thank you so much for reading out the names of the survivors and giving such weight to the humanitarian aspect of this. My cousin was shot at yesterday. The bullet splintered in his leg, and when he was rushed to the emergency room, thank goodness he survived. They refused to give him the shrapnel of the bullet because they didn't want a lawsuit pressed onto them. These are the people that worked at the hospital, and they were pressured by the military regime into doing this. So there's very real pain out on these streets, and there's very real pain that is felt by the Sudanese diaspora across the world. And I just want to be thankful for everything that you have said. My one question is going to be, in terms of the sanctions, as Ismail alluded, I went to school, medical school in Sudan. I saw how these sanctions hurt the people on the streets. They don't hurt the people in power because they have so much money concentrated in these corners of the economy. I've seen how patients can't get access to monoclonal antibodies because all of these drugs are made here in America, and patients on the streets are dying, whereas people that have that kind of money can just fly out to the US and to the UK and to get that kind of treatment. So what can be said in terms of sanctions that target the people in power and spare the people of Sudan more pain and more misery? Thank you.
Thank you, Ilaf. Let's take another question before. Okay. Sorry. Yeah.
Feel free to start talking.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. I was wondering, we've talked a little bit about foreign policy and the impact of potential civilian government, and it links to a few different
Sorry,
points.
can you introduce yourself first?
Sure. My name is Eli Sandler. I'm an MPP student at Kennedy School. What do you think the position of a civilian government, if it came to power, would be with regards to Israel and the continued normalization process? And then, almost as a subsidiary of that, I think Salah talked a lot about, at a philosophical level, how do we stop the mentality of colonialism towards African countries, but then at a very practical level, and links to the sanctions point, maybe wider than sanctions, what could Western governments be doing? Like if you had a blank piece of paper to send to the foreign ministries of Israel or of America, what exactly would you ask them to do?
Thank you. Sorry, we won't be able to take any other questions because we're almost at time. But to the floor, to answer the question, also to offer any final remarks. Let's start with Ismail, and then we'll go to Nafisa, Zoe, and then Ilham.
Let me just take one part of that question, or questions, on the relationship with Israel. What is apparent, even from reporting within Israel on Sudan, is that Israeli authorities, particularly intelligence, have been in contact with the military in its various in its different phases, whether it be with the army or the rapid support forces, which signals that security cooperation to the Israeli government seems to be the most important thing. Going back into how the quote-unquote normalization process started with Trump administration in its final days, and the Netanyahu government in its days of battling local politics in Israel, how that came to be. From my understanding, that is not necessarily the entire view within Israeli politics. But it seems that in Israel, authorities are more concerned with military cooperation, with security cooperation, and possible economic cooperation, maybe agriculture and so forth. If the Israeli government pursues a relationship with Sudan that is linked to the military, I think the civilians in Sudan, the political forces in Sudan, who are divided on really, I mean, if we are going to speak honestly, I think there's more than one view on what kind of possible relationship Sudan could have with Israel or not. I think having that go through the lens of the military will send a signal to civilian forces of what kind of relationship Israel really is interested in with Sudan. I'll answer that part of the question, but I can leave the other parts to Zoe and Nafisa.
Thank you, Ismail. Nafisa, and any final remarks?
So to kind of talk about the sanctions bit, I think it's important to kind of be really clear on what's being threatened. From what I understand, so correct me if I'm wrong, the sanctions that are being discussed right now have to do with specific sanctions against specific individuals or organizations, rather than the kind of general economic sanctions that Sudan was under the last 30 years. So it's not a matter of, restricting access to banking or to equipment or all of these things that were very destructive for Sudan over 30 years. It's a much more targeted towards impacting how specific individuals are able to move around their specific money. At the same time, one of the fastest things that happened, one of the swiftest and probably most significant responses that happened after the coup was the halting of World Bank funding. The IMF, and that was $2 billion, and it was all going towards not exactly humanitarian, but development funding. Similarly, the $700 million from the United States was also going towards development purposes. They've said that they will continue to kind of do things like food aid and health aid and that kind of thing that are more like kind of strictly humanitarian, but you're still talking about very big projects for Sudan, things that the government was really putting a lot of hope in, things like irrigation, potentially solar power, agricultural projects, things that were supposed to kind of help the civilian government kind of create this new Sudan, pull it out of things that were, actually potentially already helping the country pull out of an economic crisis, depending on, your economic view. But things that were kind of promising to help, those have stopped, and those were likely completely kind of dead end under a military regime. So even though it's not sanctions, it's still kind of, you are imposing a lot of harm on the Sudanese people, or at least withholding a lot of benefit. So I think that, but at the same time, those are kinds of supposed to be pressure points on the military. So we are kind of potentially entering into a similar situation, and it's a tricky one for people inside and outside Sudan to maneuver. In terms of closing thoughts, I just wanted to kind of mention one thing. We've talked a lot about the neighborhood committees, and a lot of my reporting these days is talking to people from neighborhood committees and talking to them about kind of long-term thoughts as well, right? And one of the things that they had been fighting for had been representation in the parliament in Sudan. And that's something that I think as if we kind of make a way out of the current crisis, that's going to be a major demand. And it'll be really important for the continuation of these organizations to find a way to participate in an effective manner, to kind of get their full representation and not have it, as one person said, we kind of do all the organizing in the political parties, which are now extremely weak, and professional organizations have also weakened significantly. They kind of end up taking the leadership role, right? And so it'll be really interesting, but also really crucial to see kind of how these organizations that are very good at grassroots organizing find a way to kind of make their way into actual leadership. And I think that would also be very instructive. And I think is a place where there could be a lot of dialogue with other countries and their experiences in issues like that. So I just want to leave that as like a closing thought.
Thank you so much, Nafisa. Zoe?
Thank you. I'll just speak to the coloniality aspects that have been raised. I think that it's really important to think about the stories we tell and the way that we tell them. And so much, I think, powerful storytelling has been done here, and I really honor that. I think there are different things depending on your positionality, right? One is to hold space and like pass the mic for storytelling when it's possible. And for those in the Sudanese diaspora, there's a lot of storytelling that's happening. And I think uplifting decolonized storytelling is really different than just like retweeting hashtags, right? So like retweet the hashtag, but also like lift up authentic voices, bring them into policy making, cite them in your reports, cite them in your papers for my class. Like, you know, it really, like, no act is too small. Everything has to be decolonial or it's not, right? And so that's one thing. And I think just to put a point on it, you know, the Arab Spring started in Africa. So the fact that it's called an Arab Spring is a different type of story. And it really has shaped, I think, the political potentiality of this long movement of the African Spring, the North African Spring. Like this uprising is still part of that. And I think that as we start to think about kind of how do we tell different stories, how do we hold different spaces, one of the things that I find really striking, building on Nafisa's comments, and of course what you've been saying, Ilham, is this question of what is Sudan leading, right? Like what are the Sudanese people are a role model right now for Egypt, they're a role model for Gulf states. That is why it's so threatening. That is why there isn't yet a solution on the table. And I think I'm always really excited when movements are highly gender inclusive, because some of my current research demonstrates from 1945 up through 2019 that movements that are gender inclusive are larger, they're more likely to succeed, and when they succeed, they're more likely to lead to democratic and gender empowered outcomes. They're also much more likely to lead to patriarchal backlash if they fail. And so there is a responsibility on the sort of global and regional communities to hold on to the sort of potential of this moment and to let the people lead the way that they will. And I'll also just say that I think the other thing that's really powerful is the diversity of civil resistance approaches that are being used, because that's building power, it's building organizational muscle, and that's going to lead to the potential for a parallel government that's ready to receive World Bank funding, that's ready to receive $700 million US and put it directly to use. And so I think there's an element of like playing a two-channel game of trying to get the government back, but also to reimagine the state so that it's not built around the military.
Thank you so much, Ilham.
So I think someone was bringing up the point of targeted sanctions, and I know there's been a lot said on this, but just one of the thoughts that I always have in terms of, you know, sanctions being placed on a country or targeted or aid being withheld is that, especially in international politics, the temporary does tend to become the permanent. So if the US withholds $700 million in aid funding and the World Bank withholds $2 billion, there's no guarantee that at any point in time that it would go back to what it was before. And, you know, during some of the talk about economic reform in Sudan, you know, the World Bank just put out a figure that $6 billion was what's needed to even bring the Sudanese economy back to a functioning state, or a better functioning state. And so even the level of investment that we had prior to October 25th was not enough for what's happening in Sudan. It's not enough to uplift, you know, Sudanese people living around the country, not only just in Khartoum, but in other areas, other cities in the country. Life was getting very hard in Sudan. I think anyone who had been there like recently, is very easy to see the runaway inflation, you know, things that, you know, used to cost $5, cost $100, you know, those are like the scales that we're looking at. And so, you know, I think during all of this, during our discussions about the pro-democracy movement, our discussions about what the Sudanese streets are calling for, I think we also need to keep in mind that, you know, there are Sudanese people living through this, and it's not just that we can think in 2-3 years, maybe things will get better and throw away the experiences of people right now. I think, you know, in all of the talk that we have about like what foreign actors can do, you know, in a positive light in Sudan, one is definitely to center the humanity of Sudanese people and to uplift their voices, to call for the internet to be cut back on, which, you know, one way to do that would be to support the court order that in Sudan has authorized that the military is not complying with, even though the judiciary is not one of the things that technically was dissolved under the illegal coup. So even the rules that they made, they're not following their own rules. Right? And this is one of the issues with military rules, there's no respect for rule of law. There's nothing clear in the country. There's no stability in the country, and that doesn't allow people to plan for the future. So, I mean, I would just say, like, in closing, I don't have necessarily any recommendations for what the world's powers should do. But I would be willing to bet that a lot of Sudanese people in Sudan do. So maybe ask them.
Thank you so much. A couple of final things. First, we really wanted to have speakers from Sudan, but due to the internet, it was a bit challenging. We will try to organize something in the future. We can bring voices from the country right now. Thank you for the speakers for this wonderful conversation, Zoe, Ilham, Ismail, and Nafisa. Thank you for the audience for joining us tonight. Thank you for those who are also joining online. I also want to thank the Africa Caucus, the Arab Caucus, and the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs for their support and for hosting this event. Thank you, everyone. And for our audience in the room, refreshments are available at the courtyard. Thank you.
Thank you, Awal.
The person that is outside, not